typically, pivotal studies are conducted to demonstrate the safety and efficacy of a device in a well-defined patient population in a statistically and clinically cogent manner, with the ultimate aims being to secure regulatory approval and reimbursement pathways, I should say open up reimbursement pathways, while satisfying geography-specific regulatory requirements. That was an incredibly long sentence and as complicated as the path can be. Now, I realize that was a mouthful as I said that, I get it. But whether you're a manufacturer who's planning to conduct a pivotal study by yourself, or whether you're a manufacturer who's partnering with a strong CRO, from a study design perspective, you will need to clearly define endpoints, preferably outcomes-based. Like I said earlier, right? Consider your sample size requirements, control groups, statistical methods, and all of that. But there is a lot more to this. A lot of this stuff is available through a quick Google search, but you really need experience to be successful. Now, to discuss all of this in more detail, I have with me industry veterans of numerous clinical trials in Brandy Chittester, Noel Keegan, and Guido Rieger. Let's start with the first question to the team. Anyone can pick it up, but I have a feeling, Guido, it's going to be you. Often, the main reasons for manufacturers doing studies outside the US or even outside Western Europe is the lower regulatory burden, as well as lower costs and quicker turnaround quicker turnaround in terms of shorter timeframes and so on. Now, as I say this, I realize it could be a landmine, but let's start with what makes a study a pivotal study and what manufacturers must bear in mind for a global study whose data may be intended for US FDA submission, as well as for other geographies such as the EU.
Right. I would like to respond to that. So it's definitely a thing you should do. So I'm based in Western Europe, and traditionally I've been involved with a lot of studies going on in Eastern Europe for exactly the reasons you're saying. Not to mention that in Eastern Europe, the structure is different in the healthcare system. So you have larger sites, which see much more patients than, for example, in Germany or France, where you have many sites. So this is very good for study performance versus, enrollment rates, etc., and also patient access. Now, the main point to consider, so you should definitely do that. You should definitely think about involving this type of sites in let's say, non-standard Western or US geographies. But what you have to definitely do is consider that they also have a different way of working. They have different regulatory requirements, different, let's say, documentation requirements, and all these kind of things. So you have to ensure that for your study data to be used in the US or in Western Europe to the MDR or FDA requirements, the study data must fulfill those 21 CFR, and the ISO and MDR written requirements. So you need to follow the procedures, you need to follow all the steps, you need to follow the quality that is prescribed, all these patient safety points, etc., in order to be able to submit your data to the FDA or within the European Union. And if you consider that and do it well, execute it well, make sure you train the sites correspondingly, then this is not a problem. You can do it, definitely. Then there's another point, though, which you need to consider, and that is if you have data from Eastern Europe and you try to, bring this data to a conference in the US or Western Europe, the data may not be transferable. So they have several regions, but of course, indications are different, patient populations are different, and then also, let's say, not everybody will believe that the data may be of good quality. So you need to convince them. And usually the best way to do that is to combine sites. So take some sites from the Eastern Europe, for example, large sites, which will contribute lots of patients quickly. But then don't forget to have those key opinion leaders in the other geographies as well involved. Yeah.
Excellent. Yeah. be very deliberate about some of the geography-specific site selection-related items. Like you said, etiologies could be different, workflows could be different, standard of care could be different. Yeah, I mean, there are numerous examples in my mind as we come to that. But Noel, Brandy, any thoughts from you?
I think from a data management perspective, the main consideration following on from what Guido has very eloquently put across multiple geographies would be the use of a suitable 21 CFR Part 11 compliant system. And I suppose the other consideration would be that the system and the use of the right technology, that it would cover both HIPAA and GDPR requirements from a data privacy perspective.
Yeah, and then to sort of tack on to what Noel said, when you're thinking about the access to data, the different regions are going to have different requirements. So specifically with GDPR, we'll need to have, for example, monitoring visits on site to access those patient records. Whereas in the US, there are some cases where we can get access to medical records remotely and conduct some of the monitoring activities on a remote basis. And then, of course, from a site management, working with the different sites and reading the medical records source data verification, then of course we have to have local language speaking team members scattered across the study to be able to support those. Along with that is a really good, solid understanding of those regulations. So Guido mentioned it earlier, but we have to not only track, in the US I'm coming from, of course, my perspective is tracking all of our different IRB requirements or ethics committee, making sure that we're compliant, but now we have to add all the country-specific requirements for safety reporting or keeping our approvals, informed consent, all of those things. So it just adds to the complexity of what we have to juggle from a compliance standpoint.
All right, there's plenty to consider. So if one is to summarize, there are market-related considerations from a state-of-the-art, standard of care, workflow, site selection perspectives. There are clinical compliance related items to bear in mind. There are regulatory aspects to bear in mind. And also importantly, there is data quality and integrity and data capture related items to bear in mind. Let's delve into that last point a little bit more. Now, what are some of the data specific considerations for these global pivotal studies? Noel and Guido, I know both of you touched upon this briefly, but anything more that you could, tell us and elaborate on that aspect?
Yeah, absolutely. Sorry, you go ahead.
I'll go ahead. Okay. Well, from my point of view, a clinical point of view, one important aspect would be the whole race ethnicity discussion. Mm-hmm. So, for example, in the US, I think you need to always show that your data is also applicable to minority populations. So you need to provide certain Black patients in the study. Now, in Europe, maybe for historical reasons, this is a bit different. They can be sometimes, the ethics committees may not allow you to take race or ethnicity questions into the case report forms because they believe this is some sort of discrimination. So it can be difficult, and sometimes you may not be able to do it. So yeah, that could be a showstopper if you don't have that in mind and have enough data from, let's say, then if you have a global study, you include that data from the US specifically, for example.
Yeah, excellent point. Noel?
Absolutely. And I think aside from the race and ethnicity point, which is really important, just identification of patient details for European sites and as well is also important to make sure that it's not actually disclosed. So considerations such as full date of birth versus the age or just even simply the year of birth for a subject. So you want to know how old the subject is, but not necessarily the full date of birth as well that could potentially lead to the disclosure of a particular subject. And also the inclusion or exclusion of subject initials. So I think when we're developing the case report form, those types of considerations are important. And if you're looking at a global study, to make sure that you have either a dual purpose of having one set of sites and subjects that include all of that information and one set of subjects and sites that excludes that information, all wrapped up into the same case report form together.
Makes sense. Brandy, any thoughts from a local CRA monitoring requirement perspective?
I think just knowing the the why behind these things is so helpful, so that when we are looking at the global compliance and having discussions, we aren't asking for information that really isn't appropriate based on the location where we are. But, when the global teams are working together, understanding what are those differences, it's just really critical for the team to appreciate that, so that, we're really critically thinking for our specific situation and not applying things across the globe that aren't appropriate.
Right. So in hearing you all, right, there is a considerable amount of experience and expertise and understanding of a regulatory landscape, which has evolved significantly, both here in the US as well as in the EU, that needs to factor into successful study design, especially if it's a pivotal study, right? There are reimbursement considerations in addition to everything that was just mentioned. If you think about it, standard of care is not the same across the globe. To think of it, the standard of care in Western Europe may not be standard of care in Eastern Europe. I know for a fact that for heart valve studies at certain time frames, imaging is considered standard of care in Western Europe. It's not in certain locations in Eastern Europe. So combining data sets becomes really difficult as far as, some of that survival analysis and some of the actual device performance parameters are concerned. So as a manufacturer, you really need to figure out your strategy when it comes to US versus OUS markets for commercialization, because that can have an impact on what geographies and what KOLs you're going to approach from a data collection perspective. Now, US data in most cases can be used for the EU, but once again, it really depends on standard of care. And one example that I really want to point out is for an imaging device. In the past, especially in the EU, the data requirements on imaging devices weren't so heavy. That's not the case anymore. When I was on the other side as a regulator, there was this situation where there was an OCT manufacturer, optical coherence tomography, for intravascular imaging. And this manufacturer wanted to use US data for the EU. But as far as the standard of care in the EU is concerned, the uptake of OCT in the EU was nowhere compared to what it was in the US. So that data wasn't really transferable. But something to bear in mind, very quickly, I want to move on to the next question, which is, what must manufacturers bear in mind in terms of strategies for pivotal studies and considerations for reimbursement? Real quick, team.
Yeah, that's a very important point, because, getting the regulatory approval is one thing. Then you've got regulatory improvement maybe in several geographies, but then what? So if you go into the healthcare systems, you will also need to get reimbursement. And in Europe, for example, there's no out-of-pocket payment usually. So there's different reimbursement systems in different countries. So it's each country has their own reimbursement rulings. So you cannot, let's say, take data, which you have from Germany, and it will be automatically applied to France, which would be nice, but it's not. So what you have to do definitely is provide not only the regulatory data, but also provide the data that will help you get that reimbursement from the healthcare providers. So, for example, in UK, this is quite well organized with the so-called NICE requirements. Once they will tell you exactly what they need, what they require in order for you to achieve reimbursement. And if they think you have done that, then you get like a code, and you will get that reimbursement. Whereas, let's say in other countries, it will be maybe a stepwise process. They will sometimes try to avoid, they will give you a temporary code, basically. So NUB, for example, in Germany, which will provide you market access for a limited time. But during that time, you then have to provide additional clinical data, which shows that your therapy or your device is cost effective. So cost effective either by being cheaper than the established therapy or providing added clinical benefit at a reasonable additional cost. And if you don't provide that, then your regulatory data isn't worth anything from a monetary perspective.
Right. There are similar considerations in the US as well. There are various different codes that one can apply to. And to that end, it's your design, clinical trial design, and subsequent literature publication strategy plays into your reimbursement strategy very, very significantly. Very often when manufacturers think about designing a study, they're not really thinking about reimbursement. Or say, for example, if it's a Me Too device, you are considering that you could use a code that your competitor has. But there are often times where competitors or those who have been first to market have secured a type of code that makes it difficult for Me Too devices or for competitors to use the similar code. And what's more is that all of this coding related requirements tend to change over time. There is a new requirement that's about to hit the US market, and we're all waiting on it to see how that impacts the market. So long story short, please do consider reimbursement very strongly at the trial design phase itself. Now, like I said, a lot of information is available through a Google search, but wisdom is something that's gained through experience. Noel, Brandy, Guido, any final thoughts, any parting thoughts?
I think from my perspective, just try not reinvent the wheel.
Mm-hmm.
The amazing thing and the thing that I'm most proud of, to be part of the 𝗠𝗲𝗀𝗆 venture is the seamless transition between business units together and how we operate and how we're able to work together incredibly closely.
Mm-hmm.
And what that means from a manufacturer's perspective is that you can come straight to experts in different areas and to be able to get the lessons that I've learned and the hard lessons that have been, fought across decades of research, and to try and avoid, situations where we've been, hypothesizing on what could go wrong, and be able to benefit from the knowledge of the 𝗠𝗲𝗀+ wider team together to be able to avoid those pitfalls in the future. And by working together as an extension of each other's teams, you can achieve and avoid those problems going forward.
It's wonderful. Thank you, Noel. And Brandy, Noel, and Guido, thank you very much for sharing your experience, thoughts, and pearls of wisdom when it comes to critical strategy for global pivotal trials. For those who are watching and or listening, please let us know if we could be of help. We look forward to it. Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Take care.